All right, let's jump right in. Today we're diving deep into a part of history that might not be on everyone's radar, the Baltic Crusades. We all know about the Crusades to the Holy Land, but this is a whole different story.
Yeah, it's a story set in a completely different landscape. Think they
Yeah.
had dense forests, icy winds, a harsh environment. And the people there, the pagan tribes, they were warriors, fiercely defending their way of life against, well, the rising power of Christianity.
The Baltic Crusades, huh?
Yeah.
So we're talking about a clash of civilizations, right? Christianity versus these pagan tribes. But can you give us a bit more context? What was the Baltic region like before these crusades?
Okay, picture this. It's a world totally unlike the rest of Europe at the time. It was a patchwork of distinct tribes, Livonians, Prussians, Estonians, Latgalians. And they had everything unique, societal structures, traditions, and most importantly, their own spiritual belief.
So these weren't just like small settlements scattered around. They had complex societies and a deep connection to their beliefs.
Exactly. Organized societies, strong traditions, very connected to their gods and goddesses. And that's key because when Christianity started pushing in, well, it was seen as a threat to their entire way of life.
Right, so I'm guessing they weren't too thrilled when these heavily armored knights showed up preaching a new religion.
You got it. They saw it as an attack on their traditions, beliefs, and autonomy. They'd built their cultures over centuries, and they weren't going to give that up without a fight.
So how did this whole thing actually ignite? How did the Crusades get started? Did the Pope just kind of point north and say, go, Crusade?
Well, not quite like that. It was more of an official process. There were decrees from the Pope. Think of them like official orders authorizing these holy wars.
Holy wars, that sounds a little intense.
Yeah, well, that was the terminology back then. One crucial document was this papal bull called Sacrosancta Ecclesia, issued by Pope Celestine III in 1193. It basically gave the church the okay to view the Baltic people as targets for Christian conquest.
So it wasn't just a few rogue knights going off on a rampage. This had the official stamp of approval from the top.
Exactly. And this was all part of a bigger trend in the church at the time. The papacy in the late 12th and early 13th centuries was all about expanding Christianity's influence. Pope Innocent III, he was a major crusading enthusiast.
Interesting. He saw it as a way to, I guess, combat what they called paganism wherever it popped up.
You got it. So you have the church setting the stage, declaring these Baltic tribes as, well, enemies of the faith.
Right. Okay. So we've got the church declaring these folks as enemies of the faith. But who were the people on the ground actually carrying out these campaigns? You mentioned the Teutonic Knights earlier. They sound like a pretty tough group.
Oh, they were formidable. A German Catholic religious order, highly trained, heavily armed. They actually started out in the Holy Land during the Crusades there, but as those campaigns faltered, they turned their attention north.
They were looking for new opportunities, new lands to conquer, right?
Precisely. They saw the Baltic region as ripe for the taking, a chance to establish themselves as a major power in Europe, spread their faith, and, well, maybe gain some wealth and land along the way.
So they were like this elite, highly trained, heavily armed force, and they saw the Baltic region as sort of up for grabs.
Exactly. They saw it as a chance to really make a mark, spread their beliefs, and maybe even get a little something for themselves in the process. But it's important to remember they weren't the only ones involved. Danish and Swedish forces also jumped into the mix, each with their own goals and rivalries.
Oh, wow. So it sounds like it could have been a pretty chaotic power struggle. So where did these crusades first erupt? Where were some of the key early battles and campaigns?
One of the earliest and most significant was the Livonian Crusade. It kicked off in 1198 and dragged on for almost a century. A key figure in this whole thing was Bishop Albert of Riga. A charismatic and ambitious leader, he was really the driving force behind the Christianization efforts in the region.
So he wasn't just a religious figure. He was more like a general leading the charge.
Exactly. He was a really interesting guy, very driven. He saw how strategically important Riga was and turned it into a stronghold for the Crusaders. Basically, a base from which they could launch further campaigns into Livonian territory.
It all sounds pretty intense, like a really violent clash. But did the Baltic tribes ever manage to push back? I mean, they were outnumbered and outgunned, right?
Absolutely, they did. They were incredibly resilient and resourceful. One of the most striking examples is the Battle of Saul in 1236. It was a massive clash between the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, who were allied with the Teutonic Knights, and a coalition of Samogitian and Semi-Gallian warriors.
Sam Magician and Semi-Galleon. Wow, those are some names. They sound like they're straight out of a fantasy novel.
They do, don't they?
Yeah.
And their fighting spirit was just as legendary. The Samagicians, in particular, they were known for their horsemen and guerrilla tactics. They really knew how to use the dense forests and the unpredictable landscape to their advantage.
So they were using the environment as a weapon.
You got it. And at the Battle of Saul, they completely surprised the Crusaders. It was a devastating defeat, hundreds of Knots killed, and the Crusader advance was halted for years.
Wow, that's a real David and Goliath story. It sounds like the Baltic people weren't just accepting their fate, they were fighting back with everything they had. Were there any particular leaders who emerged as symbols of this resistance?
Definitely. One really inspiring figure was Viestards, a semi-Gallian prince. He led his people in a prolonged resistance against the Teutonic Knights, and he was known for his cleverness, bravery, and absolute dedication to keeping his people free.
These are incredible stories of courage and defiance, but I imagine that in the long run, the Teutonic Knights, with all their weaponry and organization, started to gain the upper hand.
Unfortunately, you're right. Over time, the sheer force of the Teutonic Knights began to take its toll. The Prussian Crusade, which raged on for most of the 13th century, is a really dark chapter. The old Prussians, they fought hard and for a long time, but they were eventually overwhelmed. It was a brutal and systematic campaign of subjugation.
That's heartbreaking. What kind of tactics did the Teutonic Knights use to become so dominant?
Well, for one thing, they were masters of siege warfare. They built these huge, imposing castles, strongholds and symbols of their power. They also used scorched earth tactics, burning villages and crops to break the spirit of resistance.
So we've talked about how the Baltic Crusades began, the main players, the resistance of the Baltic tribes. But what about the long-term consequences? How did these campaigns actually change the Baltic region?
One of the most immediate and obvious impacts was forced conversions to Christianity. Pagan sites were destroyed, churches and monasteries were built, and the old ways were systematically suppressed.
So it was a total cultural overhaul.
In many ways, yes. It wasn't just about religion, it was about imposing a whole new way of life. Latin replaced the traditional writing systems, they brought in feudal systems of governance, and the old tribal structures were gradually dismantled.
It's hard to imagine the scale of that kind of change. But was it all just brute force? Or were there more subtle ways that the Teutonic Knights asserted their influence?
Oh, they were clever about it. They would offer land and privileges to those who converted to Christianity, a system of rewards and punishments to encourage assimilation. Kind of a carrot and stick approach.
So a mix of force and incentives. But I can't imagine everyone just accepted these changes without pushing back. Was there any attempt to hold on to their traditions?
Oh, absolutely. There was constant resistance, these pockets of pagan belief that persisted despite the pressure. Folk traditions, stories, rituals, these were all passed down, often in secret, preserving elements of the old ways.
That's incredible. It shows you the resilience of culture, even when facing overwhelming force. But we've been focusing on the Baltic people as the victims. What about the Teutonic Knights themselves? Did they stay unified and driven by religious zeal throughout the Crusades?
That's where things get interesting. The Teutonic Order itself underwent a dramatic transformation. They evolved from a religious military order into a powerful state, controlling vast territories and wielding serious political influence.
So the Crusades became a vehicle for their own ambitions. It wasn't just about spreading Christianity anymore. It was about power and land.
Exactly. And as their power grew, so did their corruption. Internal conflicts, political maneuvering, a hunger for wealth and influence, it all started to erode the order's original religious ideals.
It's almost like a classic story of power corrupting, right?
Yeah.
But if they were becoming more focused on these worldly things, did the intensity of the Crusades themselves start to die down?
In a way, yes. The decline of the Baltic Crusades is really intertwined with the decline of the Teutonic Order. As their power weakened, their ability to wage these massive campaigns diminished.
Okay, so what caused this powerful order to fall apart? What brought them down?
It was a combination of things. Internally, corruption and infighting were tearing them apart. And externally, they faced growing resistance from the Baltic people, who were becoming more organized and strategic in their opposition. They also had pressure from their neighbors, like Poland and Lithuania, who saw the Teutonic Order as a threat.
So they were basically surrounded by enemies, both inside and out. Was there a specific turning point, a moment that marked the beginning of their downfall?
Yeah, there was a major battle, the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. It was a clash of Titans, the Teutonic Knights, against a combined force of Polish and Lithuanian armies. It was a crushing defeat for the order. shattered their image of invincibility, and really marked the beginning of their decline.
So Grunwald was the beginning of the end for their dominance. It's interesting how this story, which started with so much religious zeal, ends up being about power, ambition, and eventually decline. But what about the Baltic people? What happened to them after these centuries of conflict?
Well, even though the region was mostly Christianized by this point, the impact of the Crusades wasn't simple. The cultural and religious landscape was forever changed, and the scars of conquest remained. The Baltic people had to deal with the loss of their traditional ways of life, the imposition of foreign rule, and the absorption of their lands into broader European power structures. It's a really complex and often painful legacy.
So even though the fighting had stopped, the impact of all that conflict was still felt deeply.
Exactly. The Crusades left behind a mixture of resentment, assimilation, and the creation of new identities. We'll explore that more in the next part of our deep dive, looking at some of the inspiring stories of resistance that emerged during this period.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Baltic Crusades. Right before the break, we were talking about the brutal campaigns, the clash of cultures, and how the Teutonic Order ultimately declined. But what always amazes me is how those Baltic tribes, they never really gave up. Even when the odds were totally stacked against them, they resisted in ways both big and small. It's really a testament to the strength of the human spirit.
It's incredible, that kind of resilience, that unwavering determination to hold on to who you are, even when everything's telling you to give up. So let's talk about those stories of resistance. Who were some of the figures who really stood up to the Teutonic Knights? One name that you hear again and again is Hercus Monte, a Prussian leader who became a legend in his own time. Picture this: a young man captured by the Teutonic Knights. He's raised and educated by them only to escape years later. And what does he do? He uses their own training to turn around and rally his people against them.
Wow, so he used their tactics against them. That's incredible.
Exactly. He knew their military strategies, their weaknesses, everything. And he used that knowledge to spark a rebellion that shook the Teutonic Order. For nearly a decade, Hercus Monte led the Prussians in this brilliant guerrilla war, disrupting supply lines, hitting key targets, and keeping the knights on edge constantly. He became a true symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope for anyone who wanted freedom.
He sounds like an amazing strategist. What was it about him that made him so effective at unifying and rallying his people?
He had this incredible charisma. He could inspire others to fight for a common cause, and he was a master at uniting the different Prussian tribes, which often had their own rivalries. He helped them focus on resisting the Teutonic Knights. Plus, he understood how important symbols were, how to rally people around a shared vision of freedom and independence.
It just goes to show how much one person can achieve, even when going up against a massive force like the Teutonic Knights. But was this individual heroism the only form of resistance? Were there more organized movements as well?
Absolutely. Along with these heroic figures, there were broader resistance movements using all sorts of tactics. Remember, those Baltic tribes, they were so connected to their land. They were skilled hunters, warriors. They knew those forests and swamps like the back of their hand.
They used the environment itself to their advantage, right?
Exactly. They'd engage in guerrilla warfare, ambushing patrols, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. It made conquering that land much more difficult and costly for the knights.
So they really used the landscape itself as a weapon. Did these movements have any real impact, or were they just eventually crushed?
Well, a lot of uprisings were put down, sadly, but we shouldn't underestimate how important that constant resistance was. It slowed the knights down, forced them to divert resources, and made them realize that this wasn't going to be an easy conquest. Even more importantly, these acts of defiance kept the spirit of the Baltic people alive. It ensured their traditions weren't completely wiped out.
So even when they faced defeat, they were still keeping their culture alive, passing it on to future generations. Let's talk more about that cultural survival. How did those people manage to hold on to their traditions and beliefs when there was so much pressure to conform, to convert to Christianity?
It's honestly remarkable. They blended the old and the new, incorporating elements of their pagan beliefs and practices into the Christian framework. It was their way of honoring their ancestors, keeping their cultural memory alive, even within the confines of a new religion.
It's like a merging of cultures, a way of adapting and surviving. Can you give us some specific examples of how they blended these traditions?
Well, think about their folk practices, the songs and stories passed down through generations. Often they contained hidden messages, subtle references to the old gods and goddesses, all woven into the dominant culture. It was like preserving their heritage in plain sight. Even traditional crafts and rituals were adapted, given new meanings within the Christian context. It's amazing how resilient and adaptable culture is, how it can change and survive even in the toughest situations.
I'm really impressed by that cultural resilience. It's like an instinct to survive, adapt, and reinvent itself. But we've been talking a lot about resistance, about oppression.
Mm.
Was there ever any reconciliation or peaceful coexistence between the Baltic people and the Christian authorities?
It's important to remember history isn't always black and white. While there was definitely a lot of conflict and tension, there were moments of cultural exchange and adaptation that led to a degree of coexistence. For example, some Baltic nobles converted to Christianity and became part of the feudal system. They became part of the ruling class, wielding power within that new order. It's a reminder that people make tough choices, that the lines between oppressor and oppressed can sometimes blur.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in these big historical narratives and forget that ultimately it comes down to individuals making choices and trying to survive in whatever situation they find themselves in. So, with the Teutonic Order declining and the region becoming Christianized, what happened to the legacy of those crusades? How did they shape Eastern Europe in the long term?
The Baltic Crusades, while maybe not the most famous part of European history, really left their mark on the region. You can see their influence in the borders that were drawn, the languages spoken, the whole religious and cultural landscape. The Baltic states, as we know them, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they were formed by this time of intense conflict and change.
It's amazing how events from centuries ago can still have such a lasting impact. Can you give us some specific examples of how that legacy played out?
Well, one major impact was the integration of the Baltic region into Western Christendom. This had a huge influence on their development culturally and politically, linking them to broader European trends and power structures. But of course, it came at a price. The Baltic people had to reconcile with losing some of their traditions and dealing with foreign rule. It's a double-edged sword,
Yeah.
becoming part of a bigger world, but losing some cultural independence.
It makes you think about the psychological impact, the feeling of injustice that could linger for generations.
Absolutely. The memory of the Crusades, with all the violence, forced conversions, and cultural suppression, became a powerful symbol of resistance and even a source of national identity. It fueled a desire to reclaim their pre-Christian heritage, which played a big role in the Baltic national awakenings in the 19th century, eventually leading to their independence in the 20th century.
So the very forces that tried to erase their culture actually helped create a distinct Baltic identity. It's fascinating how these unintended consequences can ripple through history.
Exactly. It shows that history is never a simple, straightforward story. There are always twists and turns, unexpected outcomes. The memory of those crusades, with all its complications and contradictions, became a major force in shaping their culture and politics long after the battles ended.
We've covered so much, from the initial clashes to the resistance and cultural survival, but there's a question that's been on my mind. Were these really holy wars, like they were often portrayed, or were they something else entirely?
It's a question that's puzzled historians for ages. On the surface, the Baltic Crusades look like they fit the mold. Papal decrees, crusader knights, a mission to convert pagans. But if you look closer, you see a much more nuanced picture. One where religious fervor mixes with political ambition, economic greed, and a desire for power.
So it's not just a simple story of good versus evil. There were darker motives at play.
Absolutely. You could even argue that the Baltic Crusades were, in many ways, a form of colonialism. Think of it as a brutal campaign of conquest and control disguised as a religious mission. The Teutonic Knights were masters at using the language of faith to justify expanding their territory and grabbing wealth.
It's a good reminder that we often get history from the victor's perspective, and we need to dig deeper and question the narratives we're given. So if it wasn't just about religion, what were the driving forces? What did those involved hope to gain?
Well, let's start with the Catholic Church. For them, it was about growing their influence, consolidating power, and eliminating any perceived threats to their authority. The Baltic region, with its pagan beliefs, was a challenge to their worldview, a frontier they felt needed to be brought under their control.
So for the church, it was about power and control, even if it was presented as a religious mission. What about the secular rulers? What were their motives?
For the kings and princes who backed the Crusades, it was often a more practical calculation. They saw a chance for political and economic gains. New territories meant more resources, land, taxes. They also wanted to control trade routes and expand their influence. It was an opportunity to boost their power and wealth, and the religious justification was a convenient way to mask their ambitions.
It sounds like a mix of motives: religious zeal, political ambition, economic greed, all tangled together in this complex story. And what about the Teutonic Knights themselves? What were they ultimately after?
For them, the Baltic Crusades were a chance to create their own domain, a powerful state separate from the traditional powers in Europe. They wanted a theocratic state ruled by their order, a bastion of Christianity in what they saw as a pagan wilderness.
So they weren't just fighting for God. They were fighting for their own vision, their own ambitions. It's interesting how this religious order got so mixed up with power and politics.
Exactly. That initial religious passion gradually shifted into something more worldly, driven by land, wealth, and influence. The Crusades became a tool to achieve their goals. It shows how even institutions with religious roots can fall prey to the temptations of power.
But with all those competing interests and motivations, it must have been hard to maintain a united front. Were there any internal conflicts among the Crusaders themselves?
Oh, absolutely. The Baltic Crusades weren't this single united movement. There was constant tension and rivalry among the factions. The Teutonic Knights, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, the Danish and Swedish forces, and all the local bishops and nobles with their own agendas. They'd clash over territory, resources, and influence, which really undermined the idea of a united Christian cause.
It sounds like a bit of a mess at times. Did that lack of unity play a role in the decline of the Crusades?
Without a doubt. That lack of unity made them vulnerable to counterattacks and weakened their control over the lands they'd conquered. They were constantly fighting on multiple fronts, both against the Baltic tribes and amongst themselves, which drained their resources and sped up their decline. It's a classic example of how infighting can bring down even the most powerful groups.
Okay, let's get back to the Baltic people. We talk about their incredible resilience, their ability to resist and adapt under pressure. How did they manage to hold on to their culture and identity during this tumultuous time?
One key to their survival was that they never completely gave up their belief systems and traditions. Even those who converted to Christianity often did so outwardly while secretly practicing their pagan beliefs. It was a way of staying connected to their heritage and ancestors, a subtle but powerful form of resistance.
It's like a secret cultural current running beneath the surface of the dominant religion. Did they come up with any other ways to preserve their heritage?
They were very creative. They wove elements of their traditional stories, songs, and rituals into the Christian framework. They found ways to celebrate their heritage without directly challenging the church. It's really a testament to their ingenuity and determination to keep their traditions alive.
It's inspiring to see how they navigated such a challenging and oppressive situation. But we've been focusing on the big picture. Are there any personal stories or anecdotes that give us a glimpse into the lives of the people who lived through these times? Stories that capture the human cost of these conflicts, both for the conquerors and the conquered.
There are a lot of those stories, and they really show the human drama that unfolded. We have accounts of Baltic women forced into marriages with crusaders, their lives completely changed by this clash of cultures. We have stories of children taken from their families and raised as Christians, cut off from their heritage. And we have stories of brave warriors, both Baltic and crusader, who fought and died on those battlefields, their dreams and hopes lost in the fighting.
It's a reminder that history isn't just dates and battles. It's about real people, their lives, their losses. It's about the lasting effects of conflict, the scars left on individuals and societies. And speaking of scars, let's talk about the lasting impact of the Baltic Crusades. How did all those centuries of conflict shape Eastern Europe?
The Baltic Crusades, even though they're often overlooked in the grand sweep of European history, had a huge impact on the region. They brought Christianity to the Baltic states, integrated them into Western Christendom, and created new power structures that would last for centuries.
So they basically set the stage for the modern Baltic states as we know them today.
Exactly. The borders that were drawn, the languages spoken, the religious and cultural influences, all of these were shaped by the Baltic Crusades.
It's mind-blowing how events from so long ago can still have such a powerful impact on the world today. But as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I have one final thought-provoking question. If we could go back in time and change things, would we? Were the Baltic Crusades, with all the violence and upheaval, a necessary evil, or were they a tragic mistake?
That's the question that's been debated by historians, philosophers, and theologians for centuries. There's no easy answer. On one hand, the Baltic Crusades brought major changes, leading to Christianity in the Baltic states and their eventual integration to Europe. But those changes came at a terrible price. Lives were lost, cultures were suppressed, and freedoms were taken away.
It's a stark reminder that history is rarely clear-cut. It's a mix of ambition, faith, violence, and resilience. And it's up to us to learn from the past, to understand it, and to work towards a future where peace and understanding are paramount. We'll explore these ideas further in the final part of our deep dive, looking at how the Baltic Crusades are reflected in modern culture, from literature and art to historical reenactments and the ongoing debates about history itself. Welcome back, everyone. We've been on this incredible journey through the history of the Baltic Crusades, haven't we? From the very beginning, that clash between the pagan and Christian worlds, to the stories of those heroic resistance movements and the impact it all still has on the region today. But as we wrap things up, it's amazing to me how events from so long ago can still affect us, how those stories from the past keep echoing in our modern world.
It really is remarkable, and you can find those echoes everywhere if you know where to look. One of the most obvious places is in literature and art. Think about it, the Baltic Crusades have inspired countless novels, poems, paintings, films, all offering different takes on this turbulent period.
You're so right. I'm a sucker for historical fiction and films that bring those eras to life. Are there any works that you think really nail the essence of the Baltic Crusades? The conflict, the resilience, the clash of cultures.
So many great ones. One classic is The Teutonic Knights by Henryk Sienkiewicz. It's an epic that revolves around the Battle of Grunwald and the fall of the Teutonic Order. It's considered a masterpiece of Polish literature, and it digs into themes of national identity and historical memory.
Okay, adding that to my reading list.
Yeah,
You mentioned films too. Any recommendations for those of us who are more visual learners?
for sure. There have been quite a few films made about this period, some focusing on the big battles and political intrigue, others on the personal stories of people caught in the middle of it all. One that comes to mind is The Name of the Rose, based on the book by Umberto Eco. It's set in a medieval monastery, and while it's not directly about the Crusades, it captures the atmosphere of the time perfectly. The tension between faith and reason, those power struggles within the church.
Oh, I've heard of that one. I'll have to check it out. But it's not just art, right? The legacy of the Baltic Crusades shows up in other parts of our culture too.
You're absolutely right. Historical reenactments are huge in the Baltic region. Thousands of people take part in these events, recreating the battles, wearing the costumes, even living like they did back then. And it's more than just a show. It's a way for people to connect with their heritage, to really experience history in a visceral way.
I love that. Reading about history in a book is one thing, but actually seeing it come to life, like that, the clashing swords, the weight of the armor, it must be incredible.
It really is. And it's not just for entertainment either. These reenactments are a great way to learn and reflect on the past. They get people thinking about the long-term consequences of conflict and cultural exchange. And they spark all sorts of questions about how we interpret and remember history and how that shapes how we see ourselves in the world.
It's like breathing life into history. It's not just a bunch of facts and dates, but a living, breathing story that we connect with on so many levels. But even as we try to understand the past, there's always room for debate, isn't there?
Absolutely. There are still so many unanswered questions about the Baltic Crusades, and people see them in very different ways. There are ongoing debates among historians about what they really were, why they happened, and what their impact was. Some historians believe they were a necessary evil, a force that brought Christianity and civilization to the region. Others see them as this brutal act of colonialism, a tragic example of religious intolerance and cultural suppression.
So even centuries later, we're still trying to figure them out, to make sense of those different perspectives and grapple with the moral questions they raise. Why do you think these debates are still so heated, so emotional?
Well, the Baltic Crusades touch on some really sensitive topics: religious freedom, cultural identity, national sovereignty. These are things that people feel deeply about, and the legacy of those events still shapes how people in the region view themselves, their history, and their place in the world. The way we interpret the past really does have a real impact on the present, and that's why these discussions are so important and often so contentious.
It's a reminder that history is never totally objective. We always view it through the lens of our own values and experiences. But it's important to approach those debates with an open mind, willing to listen to and understand different points of view.
I completely agree. We need to get past simplistic judgments and easy answers. History is full of subtleties, and it's only by talking openly and honestly that we can really understand those complexities and learn from the past.
As we finish our deep dive into the Baltic Crusades, I'm struck by just how vast and complex history really is. It's this incredible mix of faith, ambition, violence, and resilience. And it's our responsibility to learn from it, to engage with it honestly, and to use those lessons to make a better future.
Well said. History is an amazing teacher, and the Baltic Crusades offer us so much insight into what it means to be human, the challenges of cultural exchange, and the enduring power of faith and resistance.
Thank you so much for being our guide on this journey. It's been an incredible learning experience. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating chapter in history. Dive into the books, the films, the stories, the debates. Through exploration, we can all gain a deeper understanding of ourselves, our world, and how the past shapes who we are today.